Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Bread of Life channel. I am here with Dr. Zachary Ardern. He's an evolutionary biologist and a Christian and a wonderful man of faith. So I'm really looking forward to hearing his perspective today. Thank you for being here, Dr. Ardern.
Yeah, hi Rebecca. It's great to be here.
Yeah. And for those who watch my channel regularly, you'll know that I'm a young earth creationist. But I don't want anyone to think that you have to be a young earth creationist like me in order to be a Christian. There's Christians who have different perspectives on creation. And so it's a real blessing to be able to hear your perspective, Dr. Ardern.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, there's such diversity in how Christians deal with science. So I'm looking forward to getting into some of those details.
Cool. Will you tell people a little bit about your work?
Yeah, so my field of research is called bacterial evolutionary genomics. So bacterial's pretty obvious, mostly looking at bacteria, but also some work in viruses. Evolutionary genomics because I'm exploring the history and origins of bacteria and a little bit in viruses using genomics. And genomics is the study of whole genome sequences. So I'm looking at how DNA letters are changing at a very large scale over long periods of time, comparing different genomes to each other and inferring history. Sometimes very short term, things like the COVID pandemic, the SARS-CoV-2 virus. I've done some work on that. So that's just the span of a couple of years, or sometimes over longer time spans, larger distances between related genomes.
Wow. And so what caused you to get interested in the field of evolutionary biology?
Yeah, so evolutionary biology is a really interesting field because it deals with some really big questions of origins. And a lot of people I think are curious about these questions. And I realized, I guess, as a teenager and studying biology at university, that in recent years, we've learned a lot more about molecular details of some of these processes. So I was interested in the big questions. I was also studying philosophy at university because I was interested in those questions and decided that we'll just realize how much we can start to understand by looking into molecular biology from an evolutionary perspective, evolutionary lens, trying to answer evolutionary questions about how things are related to each other. So yeah, I think it's really fascinating. And it's a field that's developed a lot in the last few years, so it's quite interesting to be part of.
Good. Cool. Well, and how long have you been a Christian?
Yeah, so I was raised in a Christian family, and a fairly standard story. As a teenager, I started to really understand it and own this faith for myself. And haven't had good reason to change that since. But have come across lots of different perspectives and have been challenged a lot by friends and others, and have kind of had to work through various issues, including evolution, in the process of doing that.
Oh, wow. So was there like a time when you had to work through like how evolution like corresponded with your belief about God and the Bible?
Yeah, so I didn't actually study much biology in high school. I was mostly doing physics and chemistry and the science side of things, and only really went in depth in biology as a biology major at university. And so, really, my first year of university, some of my professors were really pushing evolution, but in a context of atheism. So, using evolution to promote atheism, and that kind of forced me to really deal with what I thought about that. And I had to kind of work through various positions. I guess as a teenager, maybe for a while, I was kind of young Earth creationist, or at least sympathetic to that. A lot of people around me were, but also some people were old Earth creationist. And I probably, when I hit university, I was some kind of old Earth creationist and had to work through the details of how I would deal with evolutionary data and biology and such. So that took a couple of years, I guess, to kind of work through roughly what my position was.
So, and what is that position? Like, what did you come
Yeah.
to? Like
Yeah. So
how did you
yeah.
resolve it? Like, what was the central conflict? I mean, like, how did you resolve the issue?
Yeah, so there's kind of multiple lines of evidence or data or experience and influence from different people that kind of fit into it. As with everyone, it's actually really complicated because there's so many. It's not just one question of like evolution or creation, but there's like 100 questions, like how old is the Earth? How old is the wider universe? What do we do about Adam and Eve? How much does evolution explain? How do we read Genesis? So these are all separate questions, like, and different people who might even have the same label, like creationists, will have different perspectives on a few of these questions. So broadly, my question is that God, I think, has used an evolutionary process, and I think he's designed it. And I think it showed, as we'll come to later, I think in our discussion, I think it shows in some ways some evidence of that. But there's a lot of open questions, and that's why I think research is really important and really interesting, that there's a lot more to work out on the scientific side. Yeah, I think that's a good summary starting point, that I think God has used an evolutionary process.
Yeah. Okay. Well, can you tell me more about like the role that faith has had in your life since that time when you really like owned Christianity for yourself?
Yeah, I think it's had a central role basically, and because it's so central, it's kind of hard to spell out exactly what that means. So I think it motivates me long term in terms of how I want my life to look like over the next few decades. And hopefully it motivates me short term as well on how I behave and how I interact with people. The kinds of things I'm trying to do with my life is kind of centered on this idea that Jesus is the most important thing. That's in theory. In practice, of course, there's lots of questions that raises and lots of problems and lots of imperfection and how that's worked out. But the one way to frame it is that Jesus is the central kind of motivator for how I want to live.
And so, how does that work out practically for you? What are your goals?
Yeah, so as a Christian working in science, I'm really interested to integrate these things carefully, not to just keep them separate. And fortunately, I think there's a long history of that. I think the history of science is largely a history of Christians interacting with science, particularly in the early development of science. So yeah, I want to be part of that kind of history in being a Christian who's really actively engaged in thinking, not just scientifically, but also theologically about what science is and what my research kind of broad field is. Yes, that's a bit kind of vague and abstract, but I think there's all kinds of ways in which a Christian perspective of the world shapes the way that I do science in terms of just my everyday interactions with people. Hopefully I prioritize some things that maybe other people wouldn't prioritize because I'm a Christian. The kinds of way that I interact with people, for instance. But also the research questions that I asked, is I'm really interested in these big questions, not just the practical use of science, but I'm interested in the broader questions of origins and things, because I want to understand how God has done things at kind of the large scale with life.
Yeah, cool. Well, and like since you have embraced the evolutionary view, and obviously that's your field, and you're dedicated to discovering, how do you feel about young earth creationists like me? And wait, hold on, before you answer that, I just want to tell the audience how I met Dr. Ardern, because we met at the Capturing Christianity conference, and he and another evolutionary biologist and a physicist who believes in evolution were all riding in the back of my car. So I don't know who had who trapped, because I'm surrounded by evolutionary biologists, but of course I'm a minority. But they were just so kind to me, and just absolutely precious people. And so I felt very blessed, because I had my niece with me who's also a young earth creationist, and in her formative years. And I just loved the way that you guys talked with her about this topic. But anyway, okay, back to the question. What was my question? It was, how do you feel about young Earth creationists? And, you know, do you feel like there's animosity there?
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference in kind of how we consider kind of groups in the abstract and how we consider individual people. So I guess I feel a bit mixed about young Earth creationism, and that I think it's contributed to some unfortunate trends in the church, I think, in terms of skepticism of science more broadly, for instance. So I think it's contributed to a fear of science and a fear of the university or academia. And whatever one's views are on the specifics of young Earth creationism, I think everyone should agree that that's been quite unhelpful for the church, to kind of this distancing between the church and wider academia. So I think that's unnecessary and unfortunately something that has been associated with young Earth creationism. So I'm really interested in the history of some of this and how Christians before Darwin were interacting with science, which was much more positive, and the resurgence of young Earth creationism, which I would say is a relatively recent thing since the 1960s, with the publication of the Genesis flood. I think that's the name of the book. I think that resurgence has really overall been unhelpful for the relationship between Christianity and science. Yeah, there's lots more to say, but do you have any more follow-up questions?
Oh, well, I mean, yeah, and then you said there's a difference. So you, with individual people. So are there young Earth creationists besides me that you get along with?
I'm trying to think of my current context, but sure, and churches I've been in before, there's always young Earth creationists, and I don't know in my current church if I can think of any who I interact with lots, but sure, in the last few years, I've always been had young Earth creationists at church, though I guess usually it's been a minority position in my context. And I guess what I'm not too worried about what people answer the question. I'm actually more interested in whether people have thought through it, if they're talking about it in public at least, because the most unhelpful thing is those who haven't really thought through it very carefully at all, but are very sure about what they think about it. And that can be true on both sides, actually. There can be very kind of intellectually lazy theistic evolutionists who also say things that are just unhelpful because they're not aware of the kind of nuances of, or they're not taking scripture very seriously, or they're just dismissing any critique of evolution as if it was necessarily absurd. And there's kind of a spectrum on all these things, and some things are worth taking more seriously than others, I think. So I'm happy with anyone who's kind of trying to think through it carefully and open to what the science is saying and how to integrate that with their faith.
Very cool. Okay, so can you tell us more about now? You mentioned that you feel like God kind of set up evolution as a process. Can you tell me how, like in your scientific study, like how have you come to understand that role?
Yeah, and in some ways, I think most helpful for me in this has been studying some philosophy and thinking about what science is and where God might fit into that. And specifically helpful has been thinking about laws of nature, which historically were a concept that was believed by, I think there's a good case for saying that that was developed in kind of a theistic context, that laws of nature is kind of a theistic concept, that God is ruling the universe through his laws in the same way that a king, or analogously to how a king would rule his kingdom through laws. So God is the basis for laws of nature is one of the key things. And that means that there's a really good point of connection between theology and science. It means that science is not completely separate from theology, because science is basically all about laws of nature. So whenever we're studying science, we're studying something that God is the basis of, or in some way involved in, and God is sustaining the laws of nature. Yeah, so that's one thing. And that means so if the evolution is a law-like process, that means God is involved in that process, just by, at least by virtue of sustaining the laws of nature and creating the laws of nature that are actually producing this evolutionary process.
And once God set up those laws of nature, do you think that he needed to be directly involved with the process of evolution? Like, does he have to intervene sometimes to make things happen? Or does it progress alone, like all on its own?
Yeah, so this is one place where I think thinking carefully about laws of nature is helpful. That so I would say I have a high view of God's sovereignty, or God's at least his foreknowledge, and that means that everything that happens was foreknown by God. So that means that for me personally, I don't really mind whether like the exact model of how God is interacting with the world, because whatever that is, God did foreknow that outcome, including evolutionary outcomes. So if so there's foreknowledge, but he's also actively sustaining the laws of nature. So that means that, again, all the evolutionary outcomes that are happening, God is kind of involved in that, without necessarily requiring like direct intervention, in order to say theologically that God is behind these processes. So I think often people kind of equate intervention with God's action. And I think actually God's normal action is just through the laws of nature. And that's just as much God's action as intervention would be. So an example, I think it's Matthew 6 or Matthew 5, that Jesus says that God feeds the birds of the air. And it's not that God is literally kind of dropping the crumbs in the mouth of every bird, but he's upholding the natural processes, and that's the way that birds are fed. And that's still God doing that.
Yeah.
So I would see that analogous to the evolutionary process. It's also possible that there are special points of intervention. And for me, that's kind of an open, like I'm open to hearing people's arguments for what they think those points might be. So something like the origin of life is kind of an obvious one. That's a possibility. And I'm still open on what the science is saying about that. And I'm not too worried either way theologically, if that makes sense.
Okay. But right now, to you, does it look like there would need to be an intervention, a special intervention for the origin of life? Or to you, does the evidence look like it could have happened just with God setting up the laws of nature?
So I'm not an expert in the origin of life, but my sense is that if God did set up the laws of nature, he just needs to set them up really nicely. So the less intervention is needed, the more, I would say, fine-tuning is needed. And so this comes onto something that we'll talk about a little bit later, maybe around design and stuff. But so that's why I think it kind of doesn't matter either way. So either there's fine-tuning in the laws, or in the conditions that were involved in the origin of life, or there's intervention, or there's a bit of both. And I'm not sure if science can even necessarily answer that. I'm kind of open to that. But I think life is special, and God was involved in that. But I don't think there's a need scientifically or theologically to say there was definitely an intervention. And one reason for that is that we can push that specialness back into the laws of nature or the initial conditions.
Yeah, that makes sense. And how do you understand the Genesis narrative now?
Yeah, so I wrote a couple of notes on this, that because there's so much to say about Genesis, but I think in summary I would say Genesis, by the Genesis narrative, if we mean Genesis 1, I take Genesis 1 to be a highly structured theological account of creation, maybe with the emphasis on theological. So I think it's not straightforward history, and I think this has been recognized throughout the history of the church by people like Augustine and Origen, among others. So it's not that, like what a lot of people say is that this is just a modern reinterpretation to try and catch up with science.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's true. I think just the nature of the text itself is this is a highly structured, something like poetry account, which does have these kind of highly formalized or structured elements and some confusing things that were recognized by people like Augustine and Origen well before, many centuries before Charles Darwin and such. So the technical, I mean, there's different views, but the view that I like is by a guy called C. John Collins or Jack Collins, and his view is called the analogical days view, and that's roughly that the Genesis days are analogous to our days, and as such, they're not trying to give a scientific account of chronology, but it's using analogous language about God in a similar way that the Old Testament does all the time. And I'm not a biblical scholar, so I can't go into lots of depth on that, but I think there are aspects of the text that are saying this is not just straightforward literal history.
And how do you understand like the creation of Adam and Eve? Like, do you just like do you think that Adam and Eve were like two like real people, or do you see them as metaphorical?
Yeah, so there are some reasons to take them as real people theologically, mostly from the New Testament rather than from Genesis. But that leaves open kind of the scientific question of what models work for that. And I kind of change my mind every week on which model I favor scientifically about how to make sense of Adam and Eve, like whether they were like a representative of a larger group of people, which means they could be quite recent, or they could be relatively more ancient and actually they're kind of primordial couple. Some relatively recent work has shown that the genetics of that seems to work out okay if they were relatively ancient, say at least 500,000 years ago. And there's other things to do with Neanderthal and Denisovans that suggest maybe ancient works. But a lot of these, I think all this stuff is kind of up in the air, and the science is changing quite a bit, kind of, or has changed a bit over the last 20 years, as far as I'm aware. So I think there's a lot more to learn scientifically about early humans, which is one reason that I'm not too worried about having a specific scientific model of how this fits with Genesis, because if the science is still changing a lot, yeah, I mean, I think what isn't changing is that I think there is good evidence for common descent and various forms of early human, but it's not clear what Genesis is talking about in terms of what theologically counts as human, like were Neanderthal human. Creationists actually disagree with themselves, among themselves, on where to draw the line on human and non-human. So it's not an easy question.
Yeah, and what do you think about Dr. Swamidas's hypothesis about Adam and Eve being recent? And have you read his book?
I haven't actually read it properly, but I'm aware of the overall thesis. And so that's one model, that Adam and Eve are kind of a representative couple among a larger group. And on his particular model, they're very recent, like they're only 6,000 years ago, or potentially only 6,000 years ago, and specially created, at least conceivably. And that's definitely possible. It does leave open some theological questions around what about the other people who are the other things that are biologically human, what to do with how to make sense of them theologically. I think that hasn't been worked out that well. So it's just one of the models that for me is kind of on the table, that it deals with a lot of the relevant biblical data, but I don't really have a strong favorite. I think there's just a few options on the table that we're still kind of working out, and I'm okay with that.
Now, when you were working out the various questions related to creation, as you were kind of processing and reconciling, your faith with science, what was the hardest question to answer?
I mean, maybe Adam and Eve is the hardest, but part of it is just that there's a lot that we don't know, like both kind of theologically and like the text itself kind of seems to leave open some questions, like who did Cain marry is kind of the classic question. And like the text itself doesn't give like a definitive answer to that. There's all kinds of stuff in the early chapters that are kind of strange, and we're not sure where they're coming from. Like, what about the Nephilim, etc. So there's kind of interesting difficulties just on the theological side, and then the science is really quite kind of messy and complicated, and not my field of expertise either. So yeah, I think the answer to your question is the Adam and Eve stuff is maybe the hardest, and it's one I haven't kind of fully worked out because I've realized how complex it is and how there are a few models on the table that all have things going for them. And I'm kind of okay being agnostic about those models. Sometimes I favor one or the other, but that kind of changes as I read up on different aspects of them.
Cool. Now, I've heard you say that evolution can be evidence for design. And in fact, you did a whole lecture on that. Can you explain what you mean?
Yeah. So lots of people think that Darwin's account of evolution is necessarily incompatible or opposite to an inference to design. So the idea there is that because Darwin, let's say Darwin has explained life, and people used to explain life by pointing to God, but now Darwin has explained it, so that gets rid of the need for appealing to God. So that makes sense as kind of an account of what Darwin did. But I'm not sure that it fully works when he gets into the. I think there's reasons to think that's not quite right when we get into the details. So I think some helpful context. I think the most helpful way to approach this question is to see it as kind of a worldview dispute, naturalism versus theism. And naturalism seems to imply that our world is not special. Some people call that the hypothesis of indifference. So on naturalism, there shouldn't really be anything at the fundamental level of our world that's special, as opposed to what a non-intended process should create at the fundamental level. But it turns out that there are things about the world at a fundamental level that are special. So things like fine-tuning, for instance, and other kinds of design arguments. So I just say that to start with, because I think there's helpful context that it's not just a matter of just looking at biology and asking, does this point to design or not? There's also this broader context of fine-tuning, and we already see that the fundamentals of physics, at least arguably, are kind of pointing to design. So that leaves open the question of, okay, what about biology? Is it also pointing to design or not? So at least it's on the table that it might be, given that physics already is, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So I think that's just a helpful starting point for talking through with someone who's skeptical about design, is to start in a kind of an easier place, like fine-tuning, where a lot of very committed atheists accept that fine-tuning is at least a potential pointer to design. Okay, so that raises the question, okay, what about life? Is life just explained by evolution? Does that get rid of design? My argument is that at least potentially the evolutionary process itself is set up so nicely, it's fine-tuned in such a way that it could also at least potentially point to design. So another way to say that is, if evolution needs to be fine-tuned in order to produce the kind of things that we see, then that would imply design. So that would be a way that you could have both. You could have evolution and design, as if evolution needs to be set up nicely. And I think, so at least in theory, or at least in the abstract, it's possible that evolution could point to design. Then the question is, okay, well, does it actually point to design? And that's kind of an open question I'm interested to get more feedback on and kind of work on various things about. But there are some hints, I think, in evolution that suggest maybe it does need to be fine-tuned. So some of them are well known, some of them are not well known, quite well known as convergence, that the same kind of thing seems to pop up again and again independently in evolutionary history. That seems to suggest some kind of deeper process, some kind of maybe fine-tuning, or some kind of at least special structure to evolution, which wasn't expected. Another thing is just some really improbable events that seem to have happened in evolution. So things like the origin of life, but maybe also the origin of eukaryotes, maybe the origin of humans, various things it's relatively mainstream to say, yeah, these things were highly unlikely just on the standard evolutionary process, but they still happened. There's still evidence that they happened. But I think the fact that there's something like a large input of chance that's required, maybe could also be a separate way to think that that's kind of a pointer to some kind of supervision of the process, or some kind of God's potential involvement in the process. There's other things as well. So I've done some research on the genetic code, so the specific mapping between nucleotides and amino acids. That's at least really interesting. It's really fundamental, and it looks really special. And there's other things as well. So I've given some lectures that are on YouTube that people can look up if they want to go into the biology of that. But at this stage, I just say there's quite a few features that are fundamental to evolution and fundamental to biology that seem to be suggesting that maybe it is set up more nicely than we would expect on this kind of naturalistic hypothesis of indifference.
Yeah, now I don't know how deeply we want to get into the science stuff, but I am kind of curious, because one of my complaints about evolution is that it seems to work in the opposite direction that it's proposed to work. Like, things are breaking, things like mutations are in general not good for organisms and stuff. So and I know that you're doing research into de novo genes. And so can you tell me what's your response to my complaint?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's not a silly question. So mutation is broadly expected to be detrimental. Then the question is, are there exceptions to that? And the answer is yes, there are lots of exceptions to that, of mutations that are not straightforwardly detrimental. So my PhD research was in a field called experimental evolution. So this is evolution over in the lab of microbes over a few hundred generations. So, or in other cases that other people have done, a few thousand generations. So my PhD was kind of analyzing data from a previous experiment with a few hundred generations. And the whole field, in the field in general, we see a lot of mutations that are not just straightforwardly detrimental. We often see gene copy number changes. So that might seem kind of boring, but it has interesting, quite dramatic effects. So a gene gets copied. That means you're producing more of the protein. That means the cell does a lot better. It's much more fit. It quickly dominates the population. So this happens all the time in experimental evolution. And there's other kinds of mutations happen as well. So that's an example of something that's really interesting and beneficial for fitness that isn't deleterious, but is a result of mutation. So you can't generalize to all mutations break stuff. That's not true. An example is gene duplication, chromosome duplication, but also other things that just a lot of mutations are roughly neutral. They're neither deleterious nor beneficial. Those are interesting because in future, in a different context, that neutral variation can end up being beneficial in other contexts. And when you have large enough populations, as you do particularly in viruses and bacteria and other microbes, you explore a huge number of possibilities and can have really interesting results directly before your eyes. And it's not just theoretical or inference. You can see it even within the COVID pandemic. You see a lot of evolution of the virus, and it's not just breaking stuff. But feel free to push back.
And I didn't mean to say that every mutation is detrimental or deleterious, but I mean, in general, it seems like the trend is that way, but we need the trend to go in the opposite direction. So do you mentioned gene copying and things that could possibly be helpful and cause new things to arise. But do you have do you have evidence that there's enough that's working in the direction of positive to overcome the negative trend?
Yeah, so when we talk about the overall trend, what we're interested in is what gets, not just what happens in terms of mutations, but what gets fixed in the population, what survives in the population. So that's why the overall distribution of mutations is not as important as the mutations plus selection afterwards. And selection, of course, is critical. That selection is filtering out a lot of the bad stuff and a lot of the neutral stuff, and even some of the beneficial stuff. But a lot of the neutral stuff and a lot of the beneficial stuff survive selection. So the distribution before selection and the distribution after selection is obviously different, and that's kind of the basics of Darwinian evolution, which is critical. So that's the first thing that I guess what we mean by overall trend needs to be spelled out, and the trend needs to take selection into account in other aspects of population dynamics as well that affect which things actually survive in the population. The second thing is it's not just theoretical that gene copy could be useful, but it's what we see in the lab in experimental evolution, that this gene did get copied, and this, when that happened, it increased its growth rate a lot and it survived better. So it just in the data I was analyzing, the main result, which wasn't that interesting, but was still somewhat interesting, was that the microbes that we were looking at was yeast actually was growing in a low carbon environment, a low sugar environment. And these microbes attained a gene copy in a gene that transported sugar into the cell, which makes perfect sense. So you have more copies of that gene, you have more copies of the protein, the cell is able to extract sugar from its environment much more efficiently. It survived better. So that was just a nice, this was just within 1 or 200 generations, very short time scale. That was evolution before our eyes. The cell could grow better, and it was a mutation, but it wasn't deleterious. It was an advantage. And looking at genomes, comparing genomes to each other, we see this happening all the time. There's lots of gene duplications, and sometimes that's advantageous and helps survival. So if you have a gene copied, then these genes can diverge over time, and that's one of the main processes of evolution, that the different copies can attain different variants along the way, and end up with different functions or different versions of functions. Actually, there's some genes within SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID, that actually look like they originated from this kind of gene copying process. Because we can see other viruses, we can kind of trace back the history by comparing other closely related viruses and see some gene copies. But those genes in SARS-CoV-2 do slightly different things than the original gene. So this kind of thing is happening all the time, and I think there's good evidence for it.
Okay, well, thank you. And I didn't intend to go too deep into the science today because just my questions to you that I gave to you were more about faith. So I'm sorry if that's putting you on the spot, but I figure you're an expert in the field. So, okay, so I guess were there more things that you wanted to share about design and or any aspects of related to faith and how you came to that?
Not really. I guess I just encourage people to look into it, and I think most helpful is kind of stepping back and trying to see the bigger picture. So things like laws of nature, things like how is the whole universe set up, fine-tuning. So for me, at least, I find fine-tuning really interesting and a nice kind of framework in which to fit things. Like, okay, if it is true that the universe is fine-tuned at a deep, fundamental physical level, and there's some evidence to think that, then what would be the case in biology? What might be the case? And that's what kind of motivates some of my research on fundamental biology is, well, how is biology set up? Is it different to what we might expect? Why is it that evolution does work so well? I think kind of going back to what I was saying before, it's not just a given that evolution does work, which most naturalists would just take for granted. Okay, evolution you get for free. But one area that shows this is the whole area of evolutionary simulations. Like if you want to simulate evolution doing something interesting, you actually need to fine-tune that simulation. It's not just any old random simulation of evolution will produce interesting stuff. And if that's true, and I think there's very good evidence for it, then that implies that maybe evolution itself is also fine-tuned, given that it produces such amazing things like the human brain and bacterial flagella and all this interesting stuff. Yeah, so that's how I think about it anyway.
In like the development of your faith, what really compels you about Jesus Christ?
Yeah, so again, there's, I think, lots that could be said, but I think I just want to stick to something that seems most relevant in this context. That I think if someone's considering Christianity, or even if they're not, but they're starting to realize maybe they should, I think the context for Jesus is really important, that it's not just comparing Jesus as a random person who lived at some point, but seeing the context in two different ways. First is the Jewish context, that Jesus is making claims about himself in the context of the Old Testament, that he's making these massive claims to be the God that is that reveals himself in the Old Testament. So I think as I've realized that more, that's helped me appreciate Jesus more, that he's not kind of just a kind of arbitrary historical figure. It's not just that God arbitrarily sent his son to reveal himself to humans, kind of completely independent of history, but that there's this long history in the Old Testament that really integrates so nicely. And I think that's one of the main evidences for Jesus, is how well he fits with the Old Testament and how he fulfills so many different strands of what's happening in the Old Testament. So that's a whole kind of conversation worth having if someone's exploring Jesus. And the other one is just seeing Jesus as creator. And I think understanding that as part of his claim to being divine or being somehow really closely related to God that he seems to make in the Gospels, part of that is he's making a claim to creation. And that's one reason why Jesus is relevant to people, because he's claiming to be creator of everyone. So yeah, I think that the context of the question of why should someone take Jesus seriously, part of the answer to that is, well, he created you. And therefore we have some kind of obligation to him. We have some, that's why he's relevant to us, because not just because he's some person who lived a long time ago who might be God, but because God sustains everything and Jesus is claiming to be the Son of God and like intimately connected to God. That's why he's relevant. And that's why some of these kind of science faith origins questions are really important theologically, because they're getting at how God has created the world, and that impacts how we think about Jesus as well.
Okay. And was there a particular point when you said, yeah, I believe that Jesus is who he claims to be. I believe he's the creator.
Yeah, so I mean, having grown up in a Christian family, I could point to various points that were important, but I don't think I can, in hindsight, be like completely definitive about which was the point. I think it was more just a growing realization that yeah, this is true and important, and has all kinds of implications for my life. And I just worked through that as a teenager, like a lot of people do. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I just was impressed by the lives of some of my Christian friends that I had around me, and that persuaded me to take Jesus really seriously. And at various points as a teenager, I realized that personally this is actually important and needs to impact like the way I'm living and the way I'm relating to God.
Yeah. So what would you say to people who are kind of in that wrestling state, where they're kind of trying to figure out science and faith and whether they should believe in Jesus and how to reconcile that? What like, do you have any advice for people who are going through that?
Yeah, lots of things to say, but I think just again, just trying to step back and trying to see the bigger picture of God as creator in a general sense, that God created everything, and not focusing too much on specific details of evolution or specific historical things. I think it's more having the framework of the bigger question of, is there a creator? And if we come to think that, yeah, there's some reason to think that, then can we come to know him? And that's just a really helpful context for thinking about Jesus, I think. And part of that is recognizing the spectrum of Christian opinions. And I think that's a reason to be relaxed about it as a Christian, is to realize, yeah, maybe I'm wrong on this, but there's a range of different ways that you can do that relationship between science and faith. The main thing is that the Christian view of the world gives a context for doing science, for understanding an orderly universe, for wanting to do that is really helpful. And that kind of gives some added support to the idea of God as creator.
Very good. Well, I'm trying to look through and see if there's any questions in the chat. If anybody has a serious question right now, please do put it quickly and we'll ask. So thank you so much for being here today. It is a real blessing to get to hear from somebody who's a professional in evolutionary biology, but also just a very strong and wonderful Christian. So I hope this benefits people. And
just a quick comment on that I've met a number of Christians in my field and in adjacent fields. So it's not like there's just one of me. People seeing this might kind of discount it and say, oh, well, that's, there's always one crazy person in any field. But actually, there's plenty of Christians in evolutionary biology. Some of them are fairly prominent. Lots of them are younger, like me. So it's not just a one-off kind of thing. And yeah, people can look into it more. I encourage them to look into what Christians have said about it.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I've heard that, like, especially biology is just dominated by people that are atheistic. So do you think it is a majority of biologists are atheists, or do you think that's like just an incorrect statistic?
There are lots of atheists, but there's also lots of agnostics, and I think probably agnostics outweigh atheists. And there's also a lot of people who are spiritually interested in some way, or have some kind of spiritual practice or spiritual interest on the side that they kind of just try not to keep. They just keep them very separate from their day job as a scientist. So I think people would be surprised at how few are hardline atheists. In evolutionary biology, it's a bit more for various reasons, maybe partly because people of faith have been kind of intimidated by evolutionary biology and haven't gone into that field. But even in evolutionary biology, there's a number of leading people who are Christians and others who are sympathetic or open or exploring.
Okay, cool. And, actually, I think we have an evolutionary biologist that's watching right now, Dr. Joel Duff. I think he's an evolutionary biologist. Do you know him?
Yeah, I don't know him personally, but I know the name. So, hi.
Okay. We have a question from Peter. He says, do you belong to a particular church?
Yeah, I do. I go to a church in Cambridge. It's an Anglican church. I won't say the name of the church, but it's an Anglican church in Cambridge, one of the main central conservative evangelical churches in Cambridge.
And Brian Stevens wants to know, do you know Dr. Cy Gart? If so, is Cy the greatest scientist or the absolute greatest scientist?
Yeah, Cy is great. I'll leave it at that. He is great.
Yes. So let's see. I think that's all the questions. Thank you so much for being here. And yeah, it's been great. And I would love to talk to you on the more technical evolution stuff, I have another channel that is dedicated to talking about evolution. So if you ever want to come on, I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, we could explore that at some point.
Well, thanks everybody for being here, and have a great day. And by the way, check out Dr. Ardern's Twitter account. He has a Twitter account that he's pretty active on. And then I think you're working on a website, but it's under construction.
Right. Yeah, my website's not very good, but people can find stuff at Capturing Christianity. I've written some articles, or they can see some stuff I've got on YouTube with Capturing Christianity and some other channels as well.
Yeah, and also if you Google him, you'll find a lot of publications that just articles on the research and stuff that he's done. So it's you can find more about Dr. Ardern just through Google. So, but check out his Twitter, subscribe to him, and thank you so much. Have a great day.